Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Property Manager Broker Podcast. I am your host, Brad Larsen, with co-host Phil Mazur here, and this is episode number 3. And so in today's episode, we're going to kind of do a new thing. Basically, it's a book review. All right, I know it's kind of weird. We're going to kind of talk through this really cool book that we found. And so the background of this is I was listening to the podcast show from Bigger Pockets. They have a business podcast show. So it's episode number 68. And they interviewed a guy named Walker Deibel, who wrote a book, Buy Then Build. It's all about a new term or an old term called entrepreneurial acquisitions, or being an acquisition entrepreneur, if you will. So basically, you are a person that goes out and buys and sells businesses. I mean, you've all heard of flippers, right? For buy and sell homes. I mean, there's a HGTV show, times 20 for those. But this is interesting to where it's a different spin on buying and growing businesses. And so I would start you to focus towards the Bigger Pockets podcast, episode 68, and then go listen to the audiobook or read the audiobook by Walker Deibel, Buy Then Build. Now, today's conversation with Phil and I, we're going to go through some of this as far as kind of what we thought the highlights were from the book, what was good and what was bad, and kind of where it applies to distinctly property managers, property management company owners. So, Phil, without further introductions, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Happy to be here. I've read the book 7 times, so hopefully we can save some people that 35-hour investment today.
I listened to it at least twice that I can remember, and I was on my 3rd listen this morning before the podcast. And so, having read the book, you may have read it in person. I'm a listening type of a person. I'll go out and hit golf balls on the driving range and then listen to a book over and over. Get on, the platform, the treadmill and listen to a book, or go run, listen to a book. Now, tell me what you think as far as reading versus listening. What were you able to pick up just in that regard?
Yeah, I actually listened to it as well, and I'm kind of half and half. I do a little bit of both. I do a lot of listening while I'm running and stuff like that as well. I think what we want to do today for people is help them decide. It's not us pushing a book by any means. It's really saying, okay, we think this is a valuable book that relates to what we're trying to do for our industry. Does it make sense for you to read it? What are the tidbits we can help you pull out without necessarily needing to read it? And if there's certain sections where you want more detail that we can't get into today, we'll kind of point you into those areas. And I think what this book does for me is it's a high level approach to what an acquisition looks like, why you would do it, and things like that. We'll try to relate that specifically to this industry. And I think we can kind of give you a cliff notes and allow you to skip a few sections in the book because you really won't need them. And then there's some really detailed stuff, like literally like accounting transactional stuff, where if you're listening to that, like it makes absolutely no sense. But regardless of whether or not you even understand accounting in the first place, if you're listening to somebody regurgitate an equation, that just really doesn't work on an audiobook. So if you want that stuff, you probably need to go buy the book, but we'll help you determine if that's really necessary or not today.
One of the things that really stuck with me about listening to the book several times is it has sort of shifted my mindset a little bit because, I grew up a real estate guy. In 2003, I started in real estate, got my broker's license, a couple years later. I've been a licensed broker for, 15 years, an agent 17 years. I've bought and sold as a realtor. I've done well over 400 plus transactions on my own in selling real estate for 8 or 10 years. And so where I'm going with this is now all of a sudden you get this whole mindset shift of like, hey, why don't you start going to look at buying businesses, like getting out there, looking at businesses. And there's a reason for that, because the parallel are homes. Homes, for example, you can't really control the real estate market. Yeah, you know this, that you can buy a home and you hope for 3%, you hope for 30% appreciation, but all you can do is hope. You can't control the home other than the condition of the home, and you really can't control the location of that. So all you can really control is the condition. With a business, it's different. You have an opportunity to inject all of your own magic, all of your own time, all of your own genius into that business to potentially grow it. Yeah, there are market implications, but you got to find the right market the right thing for you and what you like to do. And when you have that, you can inject all of your energy and make that thing appreciate 10, 20, 50% or more in a short amount of time. So you have what fellow control freaks like me like to say, you have more control over the outcome of that investment versus a stock market versus a real estate transaction. And that really kind of did it for me as far as putting it into a really cool context. What do you think so far? Just those few comments.
I think the book does a good job of helping people address their fears, whether or not these fears that are really known inside of you. Maybe you have a fear of jumping into buying a business or doing anything entrepreneurial, really, because you don't really understand it, or you might think it's too risky. The book really does a good job of addressing risk. What is risk, and where does risk come from? And I think that's something I definitely want to jump into today, because I think it made me more excited about buying a business as well, because it doesn't need to be that scary.
So our focus, you and I, is we are going to be working with businesses to help them buy and sell distinctly in the property management space, in the residential property management space. It might branch into commercial, it might branch into some HOA stuff, but essentially they're property managers down to the core. And so that's our focus, is helping them to sell and or buy. So in reading this and really absorbing it, we are building a good understanding of how to help our clients, because we are the clients. Like, we are our own clients, if you look at it like that. And so part of this is kind of, where do you start? So, there's lots of different methods. It depends model comes into it. But you would start with basically deciding, okay, I need to look at acquiring a property management company, and or I want to sell my property management company. Kind of determine the angle you're coming at. Now, if you're looking at acquiring a company, so for example, at RentWorks in San Antonio, where we manage 900 plus single family homes, I'm still owner of that company. We would look to potentially acquire, let's say, an HVAC company, right? Let's just put it in some different context. And so why would we do that? Because we see that the money going out to help our owners maintain their HVAC systems is enough to potentially start a company. However, the gymnastics of going through and finding, building a company from scratch is almost too much. So we'd rather potentially just acquire a company. So that answers our why. So if you're answering or trying to define your why you want to acquire any sort of company, any sort of business, you have to understand that there's an opportunity there to grow that far exceeds any other type of investment. You put your heart and soul into it, or you hire the right person to put their heart and soul into it, it can appreciate quickly and provide you a lot of ownership benefits. And so try to answer the why would you do this? I fumbled around it, but Phil, add a couple cents in there for me.
Yeah, and I think if you're reading the book, I think what you can do, hopefully, out of this podcast is probably skip a few chapters, because there's sections on trying to figure out what type of company you want to buy. And even within a property management industry, you still want to do that. Because there's different types, there's different angles, there's complementary things, like you mentioned, like a maintenance company or something like that. But ultimately, you have a platform, which is your property management company as it exists right now. So, what do you really want to do with that? Do you want to grow it? And how do you want to grow it? And I think the how do you want to grow it really helps you identify what type of company you want to buy. So the book mentions a few things, like, are you really good at sales? Do you have a good sales platform or a sales background where you think you can step in and really pour gasoline on a fire on a company that maybe they're struggling in that certain area? Maybe you're a really good operator and how to run really efficient businesses and processes and things like that. And you see an opportunity where it's a property management business, but maybe they are lacking some efficiency. Maybe they don't have a lot of good processes. You can come in there and immediately make a big impact. This is where, as we feel like we can put more property management companies together, this is really where you're going to have opportunity to find what's the right fit for you for within the property management industry, because what you're good at isn't the same. I work with owners of companies all the time. I work with people who are great salespeople. I work with people who are great operators, completely different skill sets. So So they might want to focus on a different type of business. If we can bring more people together, we have different types.
It's a running joke you and I have that we hear people say that they want to buy a management company in a certain market. And we almost giggle at them like, okay, well, good luck, you and everybody else, right? Because everything is so popular right now with property management companies. Everybody wants to buy one. If you put it out there, you'll get some offers. But getting the right offer, getting the right transaction, getting the deal done, that's where you and I are going to come in to assist people to make things happen. But where do you start? So let's try to fumble through this question. You say, okay, I'm going to buy a property management company. Where do I start? Well, you could go to Biz Buy Sell, okay? And it's interesting, in that podcast, they talk about, in the Bigger Pockets Business podcast, is they talk about the Biz Buy Sell platform as sort of being like the Zillow or, the multiple listing service for businesses. And it's funny because they talk bad about it. They mentioned that like 80% of the businesses go there to die, which was kind of interesting as far as you think, well, hey, I can just go into Biz Buy Sell and find a killer business. Well, the ones that are on there are the leftovers, right? If a business was really good, I think that any of those owners could basically put out a couple feelers, have one or two conversations with other industry professionals, and the next thing you know, they've got a business to sell. Okay, and there's a buyer who's interested. I know if somebody wanted to sell a management company here in San Antonio, they could make 1 or 2 or 3 phone calls and find somebody very, very interested in acquiring the business. Doesn't mean the deal's going to go through. Doesn't mean they're going to get the price they want, but it will generate quick interest. So if someone's looking to buy a management company, where would they start? Phil, how are we going to answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, the book addresses it. There's a whole chapter 5 on the search. And really they go into the value of a broker and, try not to make this entire podcast a pitch for what we're trying to do. But when I read this, it really helped me feel good about what our vision was for what you and I are doing, Brad. And, there's qualifications a broker can have. There's, you could have 3, 5, 6, 7 different letters or titles after your name. But the author even goes into like, that's not the most important thing. Really, the most important thing is your ability to get these people together and your ability to actually have some experience. So we are focused on, a niche of property management. And I think that's really important because if you go to a broker and he's just a general business broker, he's just going to go to a general business buyer. Okay. So there's this whole education process. If I wanted to go buy a business, I would have to go learn about the business, go figure out what type of business I want to buy. Well, the broker's doing the same thing, essentially. He's trying to take this huge funnel and find this little space for you. That's just too much, right? Not only is it too much work, how good of a job can that broker do for you? When there's thousands of industries and thousands of types of companies on there, and you just happen to show up and you're in the property management industry, and he's also going to look at you and say, what are the chances of me being able to find a buyer for this company? And if the broker doesn't find you attractive, they're probably not going to work that hard for you. So, that's why I think it's really important to kind of narrow this thing down into our industry. And relating it back to the book, you could probably save 50% of the book just because we skip some of those steps.
Right. Going to where you start again, I mean, that's not to toot our own horn about what we're trying to do, but we are focusing distinctly on the property management industry, the residential property management side. And that's for a reason, because it needs it. We have the experience to help the folks that are looking to sell, and we can pre-screen and filter the buyers who are actually going to close and run that company well after the transaction's done. If you put out a property management company on Biz Buy Sell, you're going to get offers from who knows where, from players that are outside of the industry that know nothing about property management, and all they potentially could do is ruin your business. They could, that's none of the sellers that you would ever talk with would say, I want to sell my business to a buyer. and then I could give a darn what happened to it after that. All of them want to look back in a year or 5 years and say, yeah, that business I built or that business I sold to them is still cooking. It's still doing good things. The team members that I put in place are still there. They're happy. They're doing good. Every seller wants that. And if they don't, there's got to be something different there, something going on. But for the most part, that's where you start. You got to find out the sellers who want to get the deals done, and then we work with the buyers. Now, we could talk all day long about how that works. Where do we start? How we advertise it? All that good stuff. That's going to be for a later show. But let's talk about using a broker distinctly. You mentioned it before, but I think people need to really understand that if you go hire an outside broker, an outside business broker who knows nothing about property management, you will spend half of your time with them educating them on what property management is. Imagine sitting across the table from a business broker in your area and you say, I've got 500 owners and then they turn around and you say, what do you mean by owner? What's an owner? And we have 400 PMAs signed with 500 owners. What's a PMA? Property management agreement, right? And so you're going to spend half of your life educating them on what is property management. We've all had that conversation with certain vendors or insurance people or something along those lines to where it's frustratingly maddening because you have to talk them through what you do. I mean, just for example, an insurance quote, just get an insurance quote for general liability. I've had to coach them on what property management is. And it's different. It's a different animal than real estate. So fast forwarding some of that stuff, we can talk through where we start and how it works. One of the things we want to talk about is kind of the flow of the book and how it talks about generating a letter of interest, talking through purchase agreements, talking through some of the financing, talking through some of the attorneys. I think what we want to briefly touch on, Phil, you and I, is kind of talking through some of the basics of what the book talks and describes as far as the flow of a transaction. Would you agree this is a good topic to go through?
Yeah, I think so because, the first time you go through anything, you're not going to have any experience in it. The first time I did an acquisition, we had a team of people that we were talking through all these hypotheticals and what ifs, and we spent a lot of time on that. But once we actually got into an actual acquisition, all of that real world stuff is what mattered. Like all of our textbook reading, so to speak, was thrown out the door because we finally had some real world experience, and it was a lot different, right? Because you don't know until you really dig in and start doing that. So I think let's talk through what it really looks like to do a deal. So whenever you go and do one, you will actually know how it works. Because I didn't really know. I mean, I wish I had this roadmap. It's not that complicated.
Yeah, here's a great example. I mean, everybody needs to be prepared for this. Okay, every single entrepreneurial property management company owner or any business owner needs to be prepared for this. You're at an event, you're in the buffet line if we ever have buffets again, or you're at a grocery store and you bump into somebody that you might know, and they're going to say, hey, I'm looking to retire next year. Are you interested in buying my business? And that's when you're like, holy cow, it just smacks you in the face. Whack. Then you have to wake up and say, whoa, I have a huge opportunity in front of me. This person just offered to potentially sell their business to me. Now what do I do? Right? It's the big giant question mark that punches you right in the nose. And this is where you say, okay, talk us through what we need to do. I need to figure out kind of what that business is worth, because they may not have an asking price. They just might say, hey, make me an offer, right? I don't have an asking price, make me an offer. How do you do even a potential offer? And so we're going to try and talk you through some of this. And so if that happens, you kind of have a general idea how to be prepared. The first thing you're going to want to do is get some basic information from them. Phil, kind of talk us through the basics of what you would need just to even look at some of their numbers. What are you thinking?
Yeah, and I'll start just by saying, like, you can literally get a letter of intent from somebody like almost instantly. And a bit of an exaggeration there, but I want you to know how simple, how few steps it takes to actually start this process. And the book explains what a letter of intent is, or a term sheet, memorandum of understanding. They're all the same thing. So the book gives you some deeper education on this so that you can feel comfortable with, if somebody just comes up and they're like, oh, I'll give you $500,000 for your business. Like, they're not just messing around, right? I mean, because That's non-binding. The letter of intent's non-binding.
That's a
Like
key
you,
point. I want to interrupt you there. That's a key point because that's what the book talks about. Is people have this fear of doing things. They have this fear of, the whole concept of paralysis by analysis. So the book really encouraged people, like, if you feel a business is worth your time, submit a letter of intent. It's non-binding. Okay, that's a good point to reiterate. A non-binding letter of intent is just like the first shot, and see what happens from there. Keep going, Phil.
yeah. So you might be able to get something like that rather quickly. Now, when I did my first acquisition, we didn't just meet somebody and throw out a LOI. But as we got more experienced in the process, we were much quicker to hand out the LOI, and there was reasons behind it because we understood the whole process at that point, and we realized that the LOI was really just it's really a starting point. It kind of says, hey, I like you. I'm willing to get to know you a little bit deeper. So it's maybe a second date or third date type of thing. So what does that look like at that point? Well, the LOI, if you get one from somebody, first of all, don't be shocked. I want people to understand that. If you rather quickly from somebody, I would say that person's probably an experienced buyer. Okay, so again, this could be a good thing. The book goes into like, should I be scared? If somebody give me a lowball deal, or if I'm a seller, am I like totally just have no idea and overvaluing my business? No, I mean, from a fear perspective, we want you to understand like there's a relationship building that starts at the LOI phase or maybe even sooner. Take this stuff seriously. People are not trying to lowball you and things like that. Like, you will get to that. We will figure that stuff out later. So don't worry about it on the front end. You're still establishing the relationship at this point. So you get an LOI, you put a few numbers on there. You say, I want to do this by this date. And you're going to start gathering the data, but the LOI is probably going to say, by a certain date, I want this to turn into a purchase agreement. So it's non-binding, but you are actually committing to doing some work at this point. And typically this is going to be you're not going to do this with two people at the same time or three people at the same time. You're saying, I'm going to give this a short period, a short window. Maybe it's 2 or 3 weeks, maybe it's a month, where I'm just going to work with you and I'm going to share all my information with you. It's going to be private. I'm not going to disclose anything. We're going to get all these. There's a non-disclosure agreement that's signed at that point, but I can walk away at any time. Either side can walk away at any time. So have confidence in that process. It is a standard business process when acquisitions happen. So we don't want you to be very weary if this is the first time you're doing it. Like, oh my gosh, what is this legal document? And like, you don't need to be scared about that. It's pretty standard stuff. And then you're going to start digging into the purchase price. You are going to get a purchase price offer on that LOI that is based on a certain set of assumptions. It's basically saying, look, I'm going to fact check you later. Okay. But I want to see if you're interested. This is kind of what I'm thinking. The negotiation happens later. So that's another thing I want people to understand. Like,
Well, here's if I may interrupt, there could be several layers of negotiation because the letter of intent is not a one-time deal. It can go back and forth just for the letter of intent. It can go back and forth 100 times, 5 times, one time. I'll give you this. No, I want this. Okay, let's change it. Let's change it. Okay, now we have an agreed to letter of intent, which is real basic. It's a 1-2 pager. And it just kind of says the real basic stuff. Then, as Phil mentioned, you do your due diligence. And that's where the skeletons will come out. And that's where the numbers will get flushed out. That's where you may have, accounting professionals take a really deep dive into the numbers of that business. And that's where you're going to find out kind of where things are. That's another opportunity for a negotiation. And so it's not a done deal at the letter of intent phase. It goes through the due diligence, it goes through all of that, and then it turns into an eventual purchase agreement, which will be 50 to 100 pages of legal jargon containing all the ins and outs of that transaction. And that's the most difficult part to get through is the end phase of that purchase agreement. Now, we can talk all day long about that, but I want to maybe shift a little bit to get moving is let's talk about the attorneys. Now, you've used some attorneys. I've got some experience in this. It just seems like right now I have so many attorneys in my life it makes me want to cry because everywhere I turn, there's something that an attorney has to be a part of. Now, attorneys, as far as deals, you have to be very careful. And the book talks about this, and I'm gonna second his sentiment about this. There are deal killing attorneys out there that get paid by the hour to do nothing but squash your dreams. Okay, you need to understand that they're there to air quote protect you, but the more they protect you, the more they charge you, and they potentially will try and kill the deal, because if they say yes, go forward and do it, and something goes wrong, they don't want to hold the blame. And so attorneys like to be some of those methods. Now you're going to need an attorney or some sort of legal type of a contract drawn up, a purchase agreement drawn up. You'll take it to an attorney's office. There might be financing involved where they're going to have some sort of escrow. I mean, all that can be worked through. It's just part of the transaction. It really depends on the buyer and the seller coming together. There is no set method to do that, but you have to understand, and attorneys, and Phil, maybe you want to comment on this, is be weary of that, because there's several attorneys in the transaction. One attorney may prepare the purchase agreement, and that's going to be on behalf of the buyer potentially. And then your attorney representing you, the seller, is going to want to review that agreement drafted by another attorney. They're going to want to redline the crap out of it, and that's where it gets bogged down, is you might be fighting over words inside of a paragraph, an and a the. It gets a little tedious. Phil, go ahead.
The first time we did an acquisition, the first couple of times, really spent a ton of money on legal, but it was really kind of like a business development expense, to be honest, because we didn't know the exact documents in the sections and things like that, how the language should read. So yes, there was a lot of back and forth. Every time you pick up that phone or send a copy of the document, you're racking up these charges. When we did several acquisitions, the next iteration was a revision. It wasn't quite as deep. So there's a lot less. We kind of developed our template over the first couple times, right? Well, if you're doing this for the first time, like, where's your template? So is everybody that wants to go buy or sell, going to go through, do you have to go through $10, $15, $20,000 in legal fees? I mean, these are realistic numbers here. Do I want to do that the first time? It's like, well, we definitely want to help you with that in order to basically help you say, okay, what do I really need? Okay, but realistically, if you have an experienced buyer, okay, they've probably been through that process, and they're probably going to come to the table with those documents. So as a seller, you got to be in a position to say, am I okay with these documents? Do I understand it? So you have to be able to gauge your own trust level. Let's be honest. I mean, we're going to help you with that. We're going to say, like, you've addressed these 5-6 areas, whatever, and this is what this means. This is what that means. What I want to caution people on is the level of trust that you feel like you need, and the amount of money which you're willing to pay for that. I understand you might want to have your attorney that you've known your whole life review the document. Just be careful because of what Brad said. I mean, the red line of death could cost you tens of thousands of dollars. So,
and this is where we come into play as well. We as brokers are hopefully assisting with the transaction, is we can take a look at a purchase agreement from an acquirer, a buyer, and say, look, these terms are absolutely, they're not going to work for this seller or any seller. You're not going to get owner financing at 1% interest for 25 years. You're not going to get clawbacks that are so ridiculous that if the seller sneezes wrong, you're going to claw back 50% of the purchase price. And so there's things that we will protect the buyer, and that's why a good intermediary, such as what Phil and I are doing here, a good broker, somebody that can be the go-between, can clean up both sides of this. We can set the expectations with the seller, say, look, this is normal per the industry. We can set the expectations with the buyer and say, look, this is normal for what this market's going to allow, and this is this price and this particular seller's temperament. We can coach both sides to make the transaction happen, creating that win-win that everybody really wants. Because if in the end of the day, a buyer wants to buy, a seller wants to sell, let's not let them get in the way of each other, right? And that's what a good intermediary like Phil and I are going to be able to accomplish in working with these buyers and sellers. So let's talk a little bit about closing and then operational implementation. And so, the last week or two of this whole transaction process, which could be 60, 90 days long, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, you eventually get to closing and you take over. And so in comes a new buyer, and what do? Right? They come in. That's where the operational challenges have gone on in our industry. For example, and I'm going to make a point, is we've seen large entities buy up smaller property management companies in our industry. When they do that, they have some operational challenges from the very beginning, because you have a larger organization now implementing a smaller organization into their processes and procedures, their personnel, their methods, and there is some rub. There's always going to be some rub. And so that's going to be something you have to pay attention to as a seller, to make sure that the buyer comes in and has a very good, solid plan for one, staffing, operational implementation, and just keeping things the status quo. So to not come in and start firing people day one and craziness that goes on. No seller wants to see that, because that's going to create turmoil in the business, and no buyer wants that either. So you've seen some of these actually go to fruition in your own business under your own tutelage. Talk us through some of the operational implementation challenges you've seen.
There's several challenges, and all of this also fits into the process of the acquisition. As buyer and seller, your expectations should be pretty clear on how it's going to go once the acquisition happens. And I think I would just say, for the most part, if you're a seller, you're going to have to be ready to step away. Unless you've intentionally been asked to stay on in a certain role, expect to be stepping away. And the book addresses this, very directly. Like, do it and do it quickly, because the moment those papers are signed, the ownership has changed, and it's time to get going. If you're the buyer, you're the operator of this business. I mean, the relationships have already been formed and things like that. It's time to get to work, and this is why they have acquired the business in the first place. And if you're the seller, it's time to move on with the whole reason why you decided to sell your business, if you're deciding to step away. So I think when those expectations are not clear, that's problem number one. I mean, because, so-and-so, the seller wants to stay, he wants to keep talking to this owner or that owner. And it's like, whoa. That is not your thing anymore. And it is not fair, and it is not good business to get in the way of the seller that you just sold this business to. Even if you have good intentions, you have to let them run the business the way they want to run it. They have a plan. So I think that's really important to know and be committed to. If you have issues that you want to address in your business when you sell it, such as this employee gets taken care of, this whatever. I mean, you need to do those things before the sale takes place. That is the right way to do it. So if you need to have it written up in the agreement, get it in the agreement. Be prepared to put a value on it. That's what I'm going to say about that. Everything has a value. If you have a non-compete agreement, that has a value. If you want to take care of a certain employee that you love, that has a value. So be prepared to pay for those things.
As we keep going on this podcast, we're going to interview other outside folks that have actually bought a business and or sold a business, to get some really good firsthand perspective of how it all works in the property management industry. And so I really appreciate your time here, Phil. Let's wrap this up. Again, I would recommend everybody to go back and listen to the Bigger Pockets podcast, business podcast, episode number 68, about this book, and go get Walker Deibel's book, Buy Then Build. It is a really good listen or read, and talks about acquiring businesses. So it's a mind shift, gang. I want to challenge you to take a look at it. It's really exciting stuff. So on behalf of Phil, this is Brad Larsen. I'm going to sign out and tell everybody to go to propertymanagerbroker.com. Check us out there, and look forward to hearing you and seeing you next time on our next podcast. All right, take care, everybody.